Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living Income Guaranteed. And today we will be discussing about education for a new world in order. And our guest is Brix Thomsen. Hi, Anna.
Hi, everyone.
So Anna has been working on the field of education for over 10 years now. She currently lives in Sweden, and she has an undergraduate degree in education and currently has a graduate degree on educational sociology. And as you may know, Living Income Guaranteed is the economic proposal to create a world wherein our basic human rights are guaranteed. And that is certainly not only the only point that we are focusing on at the moment, because we also make an emphasis many times of how we require a new education system, how we require to start considering the environment, how we require to, first of all, get to this point of educating ourselves about all the points that we've essentially abdicated responsibility on in relation to getting to this current crisis at all levels. And education is certainly, if not the most important aspect, that we've kind of left in the hands of a government, of a few people that have created this, what in the words of John Taylor Gatto is the anti-educational school environment. So Anna, what do you have to tell us about this whole problem at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's very big. It's a very big problem, and there are so many examples. You know, we could just start wherever in the education system, in my classroom where I teach, for example, just the environment, just the physical environment itself is anti-educational. You know, we stuff many students into one classroom despite a lot of research showing that it's not effective and that we should have smaller classrooms. So much of the education that we have today is actually completely detrimental according to the research that is being done, and yet, like we discussed before the hangout, we're in testing. We're seeing an increase in students in the classroom, hours a student has to be in class, a very big decline in creative subjects, physical, you know, things, subjects where you get your hands dirty, so to speak, and you get to interact with objects and animals, and more focusing on this very strict academic sort of supposedly scientific approach. And all the research, you know, we have these PISA tests that are being done now, that are being done by the OECD, basically the economic overlords of the world, and they're showing in many countries, for example here in Sweden, that the reading ability, the writing ability, the math ability of the students are below what is expected, below, for example, what they were 10 years ago when these tests started coming. So it's quite ironic, and make the education system more effective, the less effective it actually becomes. And then what is so devastating about that is that we don't, as a community, as a society, stop up and say, okay, but maybe we need to go in a different direction, instead of just doing more of the same.
Exactly. Let's look at this structural problem, because right now we know that we live in a world system where, as we've discussed many times throughout these hangouts, everything that is profitable is what takes the most attention. And currently what we see is that we are generating people that go through this packaging and marketing system, which is the education system. The more points and the better grades you get, the more marketable for the job market you will be, in essence. So how is it that we've agreed collectively, and how is it that our education system has become this this motto for evolution of humanity and efficiency? How do you see this kind of cognitive dissonance operate in the education system right now?
Well, in a way, I would say that it's not only right now, it's basically I mean, if we go all the way back to the Greeks with Plato, for example, you know, the purpose with education is to mold harmonious citizens who will serve the community. And in some ways, that's not like unreasonable, but the way that we're doing it, and especially right now, you know, that it's the economic system. And it's as you were saying, the profit optimization system that is directing the course that education is going in. So, for example, the trend that we are seeing right now is what we call the knowledge economy. So basically all the Western countries, because those are the ones that can be in the race, who have the resources, they are competing to have the most knowledgeable students, the most knowledgeable citizens. It makes the citizens profitable, and it makes the countries able to compete with each other. But it's kind of it's not really functioning on a practical level. We're seeing in many countries, like in the United States and many countries in Europe, that young people are getting degrees, high degrees, but they're useless. So there is this kind of inflation in knowledge where the country can show off to other countries, but in the end, it doesn't really serve the individuals. It doesn't serve the systems. Or sorry, it doesn't serve the students. It only serves the system.
And for the system to change, I mean, we've discussed about this point. We often tend to see education as being apart from, let's say, the entire political system, the economic system itself. What has been your experience in relation to whether they are in fact something separate or not?
How do you mean? Can you expand?
Yeah, how we tend to see politics as something separate from how our education system is built up, how it is structured, the kind of curriculum that people will go through throughout their entire educational process. How do you see that is involved? Meaning, to what level have, for example, parents or people have any say in how education system operates?
Oh, they don't have any say at all. And that is one of the reasons, is this like fundamental principle within education, that we're being educated for society. We're not being educated to develop ourselves as human beings. That's for sure. We're being developed to become functional in society, and that's something that we take for granted. But the thing that we don't take for granted is what kind of society is it that we're being educated to become functional within, which I would argue, and that I've argued in a lot of blogs, that it's actually a dysfunctional society. So, for example, just like a very real life example that many people will be able to relate to is how you have to sit still in school, and passively receive information. And I followed children who go from kindergarten and into the school system, and when they're like 2-3 years old, you see these expressive beings, and they're open, and they dare to ask questions, and they're inquisitive, and they're curious. And then the older they get, the more passive, the more apathetic, the more like passively aggressive they become, because of the mold of the school system, expecting them to be able to comply and sit still and just like absorb information without being given the opportunity to work with it and play with it and investigate it for themselves. And that's just one tiny example, out of the thousands of examples that we as teachers could give, for example, to show how we're being molded into being functional, yes, but it's in a dysfunctional system. It's a system that creates school shooters, for example, as we've been seeing in the United States. It's a system that creates increased suicides by young people in China. I think I read that in South Korea, suicide by young people is one of the most common ways to die, which is crazy to consider. So I would say that that's the most prominent, and that's, of course, very extreme examples, but it can be led directly back to how the school system is set up to comply with society, that we become compliant.
And entirely monetized as well, because not only do we see cuts in education systems, but also further dumbing down within the entire system. In your words, you wrote that we are becoming like people that go through education system as packaged products to enter the job market. And as we know, the economic efficiency, as it's spoken about in economy, it's precisely just focusing on this profitable aspect of things without looking at the consequences, at who we are damaging or harming with such decisions to just focus on profiting. So I see the entire parallel we're doing with ourselves as human beings through this education system. So tell us more about you as part of the Equal Life Foundation, which is, as people may know, Living Income Guaranteed is part of the entire plan and suggestions for solutions that the Equal Life Foundation has. So education is one aspect of that. What would you say would be the ideal education system?
Yeah, this is actually, I would say that this is the subject that I'm most passionate about. And every day, you know, I visit many different schools because of the way that my work as a teacher is structured. So I see many different ways that classrooms and actions between students and teachers, how that's structured. And well, a very basic thing, one of the most important things I would say that we could actually start implementing right now would be just fewer students in the classroom, a different setup in how we learn. Like I said, we have this very stringent, very rigid focus on passive learning, research and so much investigation being done in different ways of learning, especially how, you know, this learning by doing, how we all benefit from actually trying things for ourselves and collaborating with each other as students. So there are so many cool ways that we could arrange the school system in a way that it would actually benefit the children and the students. But the thing is that that's not our starting point. Ironically, you know, because in the news, in the media, we talk about what is best for the students, but the only points that's considered within that is how can we equip them with system to be able to compete with other people in the job market. We don't look at making them, or not making them, but assisting them to become whole human beings who can handle their lives, their relationships. And there are so many practical and wonderful creative ways to do that, like massaging, or, you know, getting to know your own body, learning about how to make a budget, real practical things like that. So I see that it's actually very simplistic in that sense, that we don't necessarily have to make these like tremendous utopian changes that seems impossible. A lot of it is just changing how we think about education. And then also for all of us who aren't politicians and people who have like this influence at a top level, to really understand and come to grips with the fact that the education system isn't effective. Because what we're seeing, for example, here in Sweden, is that there's a very high level of trust in the education system, and this kind of abdication where it's like, well, they know what they're talking about, or we don't know. But all of us, that's the thing with education, we've all been students, we've all been there, and we can all look within ourselves and see how could that environment have been in a way that I could have learned the best way possible. We can all answer that question for ourselves. We can all see how having 35 students in a filled classroom, you know, is not effective. And yet that is what is being accepted as the norm on a general level, you know. So I would say that that's like the first point. If it would have been me, or how would have I liked it to have been when I was a student, for example, having my individual needs considered. Some of us are more introverts. Some of us like more quiet environments. That should be made available. I see a lot of students that are completely pushed to the back because they cannot keep up with the noise and the speed that they're required to keep up with in the current school system.
Exactly, and also in relation to integrating these values within ourselves, you mentioned that point. And that's something that we usually bring up in these hangouts a lot, because all changes begin with educating ourselves about how it currently functions, the problems, which is exactly what we're discussing now, but how can one begin creating and establishing those changes, which begins, as you were mentioning, I mean, maybe there are many teachers out there listening and integrating this realization that you don't have to be restrained by this system itself, but it all begins with the bits of changes that we can within our possibility, because sometimes money is made as the excuse. Like, you know, I cannot have too few children in the classroom because then we would require more teachers and that would imply more money. So money is usually seen as a problem. In relation to this, what would you say about what we propose as the living income guaranteed, as that being kind of, in essence, the job of the teacher is seen as one of sharing one's principal living in the best way that you are able to. So it's kind of like a privileged position in relation to teaching.
Well, I just want to answer what you were saying about the money and people. Studies have actually shown, and I can send you the link to the study that I read. It was actually a really cool study where they investigated like what kind of investments into the education system would be most beneficial. But to make a long story short, basically what they found was that, you know, a lot of these cuts that are being made now in order to not spend too much money on education actually have detrimental effects on a long-term basis, which means that more students require special, special aid later in life, or they won't go to high school and they will become unemployed. And they actually found that the more equal, the more resources are being put into an education system. They used, for example, the example of the Finnish education system that has been, you know, praised, which of course can be discussed as well. But anyway, so what they found is that in a long-term investment in education, the profits that we as society could make from that would be like exponential, you know, in many billions of euros or dollars that we could make. And the difference with that would be to start thinking long term instead of short term, and that's one of the problems. And that's basically also what we're saying with the living income guaranteed, is we're presenting. But what is happening right now is that the politicians have often this like 4-term period, and they want to decrease taxes, and they want to give the voters results right now so that they can be elected again or whatever. All these quite like silly and redundant
popularity contests.
But what isn't being seen is that it's actually costing more money in the end. Whereas providing a whole really sound, good education system, really investing in it, would actually benefit all of us so much more in the end. Anyway, so yeah, that was just a comment on that point.
Exactly. And I'll just say very quickly, because we have MRLNTT saying, how can I join the video chat? If you want to join a hangout, you can be invited if you'd like to discuss a certain topic, but at the moment we are just having this chat with Anna, so if you have any questions, place it, and for everyone else, we will get to the questions a little bit later. So Anna, just keep going.
Oh, keep going. Okay. So the other question you were asking was about how to implement these principles as, for example, as a teacher or as a parent or as a general citizen. Yeah. Yeah, so, well, for me, it's been quite a long process. You know, I started participating with the Equal Life Foundation about 5 years ago, and have then since taken my degree in educational sociology and started teaching. And one of the points that I found when I started teaching was that I was very dissatisfied and with myself and with my work as a teacher, and it was, you know, not cool for the students either, and I could see this, you know, the limitations of the education system, but at the same time we don't have the option or the luxury of just waltzing in and changing it. So the solution is like twofold, because on one hand we have to work on the actual implementing the living income guaranteed system as a practical solution. But that's not enough. We also have to change how we approach things in reality. At an individual level. And so that's what I'm doing as a teacher. And I've been very inspired by John Taylor Gatto, who is an author and who was a teacher for like 30 years in New York, in the New York area. And what I'm basically doing a lot of focusing on is that one of the principles, this point of, like I mentioned before, how would I have wanted it if it would have been me? So I'm looking at placing myself in the shoes of the children and basically being humble within that and being curious as to looking at their perspective. And then what I did was that I realized that some of these students that I had that was quite demotivated and frantic and not really being here and being present with what I was teaching, I discovered that they actually had a lot of passion, but that their passion was often for things outside of school, like video games. I have a student that is completely immersed and passionate about vehicles, buses and ferries and airplanes. And so it actually started with this student where, you know, this passion just kept coming up, and I sat there with my grammar and my boring things that he was supposed to do, and so it inspired me and to say, well, why not grasp this passion that is within the student and run with it? And you know, we can still focus on grammar, he can still learn to read and write, but we're doing it with something that comes from within him, a passion that comes from within him, and that I actually honor as valuable. That I say, okay, cool, you have this passion, well, let's investigate it. Let's investigate the ferries and their schedules and how they work. And that seriously, that I have a passion and someone is seeing it and someone is seeing the value within it, that, you know, that's empowering. And so since I started with that, I've started opening it up with other students as well, where sometimes I also have to discover their passion or assist them, or we collaborate, you know, where neither of us perhaps know what to do. And what is so fascinating about working this way, which is also what John Taylor Gatto did, is that through this, the reading, the writing, the grammar, all this like boring stuff, it comes natural. Because if you want to write a book about ferries, you have to be able to write proper grammar, otherwise, you know, your mother won't be able to read it. And it's like, of course. So then we write about the ferries and we talk about, hey, that word, okay, how can we spell that word in a different way? But it's without resistance, it's without reluctance, and what I have seen is that it's such a shame that we completely disconnect the students, their individual needs, their expression, their passion from the school world. And many of them, most of them, are, you know, they can't stand it. They can't wait to get out of school. And I know for a fact that I experienced the exact same, that it's like this world that is completely disconnected from who we are. And that is, of course, as we grow up and become adults, that's the exact same we experience in our jobs. That disconnect, that this is something we just have to do, and our passions have to take the back seat.
That's also an important aspect, because sometimes we see, well, if we give a living income to people, people will get demotivated to work. But that demotivation is actually, now that we're hearing you, it actually comes from how the education system operates at the moment. Because if you generally had that ideal standard of education that you're suggesting and describing here, then a person would be entirely understanding that they have this point that they're passionate about and they want to dedicate their lives to, you know, develop it or enhance it and make it better. And that would, in essence, change the entire mentality of what an education system is, which is kind of giving a direction, a kind of a cause to what you are passionate about. And I'd like to say to our viewers that I fully recommend following Anna's blog, Teacher's Journey to Life, because she's explaining all of that there. She's already inspired people that are making animated films to take one of her blogs into an animated movie, which is very cool. We will leave also the link onto that.
Yeah,
And
please go and watch that. That is passion in the working.
yeah, exactly. And this is also to see how when we change our starting point, Anna is quite an example of how sometimes we think of teaching or being involved in the educational system as something boring or just kind of indoctrinating kids. It doesn't have to be that at all. And Anna is here just sharing her experience as well and how one can change one starting point from becoming adultry in the education system to becoming an innovative force that generally can change people's mind in relation to what education should be about. So
Yeah.
Anna, let's go to a question.
Sure. Okay.
Let's say Gabriel is asking, Anna, becoming functional for the society doesn't guarantee today that you would have a job and a stable position within the society to be able to live. What do you say about that?
Yes, that is absolutely true. We are seeing massive unemployment rates all over the board, all over the world, even in the rich, countries that have a high social security, for example. But a thing within that is that when we look at what it means to be functional in this context, it's not actually being functional is from the system's perspective. It is not you functioning for the betterment of your own life. What I meant by being functional is actually that you are compliant, that you accept the situation. Functional means that you don't go and do something that can disturb the status quo. So functional can also be being apathetic and powerless and desperate and not having a job, but there's nothing you can do about it, and you don't have the education, you don't have the vocabulary to be able to move yourself out of that situation. And even in that you're still functional, because what do? You consume, you watch television, you spend money, even though you don't have any money if you're able to, and kind of become numb your situation. So you drink alcohol. There are so many of these tragic lives in a way, but from the system's perspective, you're still functional because you serve a function. You participate in making the wheels of the economy run around, and you don't pose a threat. And this is not to then suggest that rioting or rebelling against the system is then what you should do, because that's also being functional within the system. Yeah.
So in relation to what you were going to mention, I actually stopped you before you were going to mention something, so if you still have it in mind, just go ahead.
Yes, I was going to say that because what I was talking about before with reading and writing and stuff like that, right now we have to learn to read and write to survive. And there is this underlying fear of not surviving. There's this underlying pressure that we have and compete and make a living. But if you see what I was explaining before with the example, reading and writing and maths become a tool, become something that we can use to express ourselves and get our passion across and share it with others. And so the current direction that we're going in is oppressing expression. It's oppressing passion, and this like extreme emphasis on reading and writing in the way that it's being done. It's actually creating very fearful human beings who aren't capable of making decisions for themselves. So it's like it's quite silly in a way, because reading and writing and maths are very important, but it's the starting point that with which we're teaching it, that it's creating this entire resistance and reluctance within students. And many teachers I know will recognize that they're struggling because the students aren't motivated, and it's not so strange because they feel that fear, they feel that pressure. Instead of education being a process of exploration and development, something that actually is supposed to be very enjoyable and fun, or it could be.
It could be, and we are shooting our own legs, as they say, when we are talking about this cookie-cutter type of mentality in relation to the education system, which should be the foundation and the base for the entire change in the world. if we generally apply these principles and this realization that I can make a difference either by being a student or a teacher or any other position in society, that's where the values are missing, because as we are seeing, dysfunctional economy, dysfunctional society, this idea is only veered toward making profit, making the most interest for a few. So to change the starting point of the education system, we also have to change our own starting point of how we participate in it, but most importantly, and I bet you agree, to understand how the entire education system has been almost like a plot to kind of remain within this current enslavement that we're essentially living in as society all over the world. We have a comment from Gabriel saying, in relation to the comment that you said, which is fascinating because becoming functional from the perspective of the system means to be actually lacking enough education and abilities and skills to be able to live. Which is essentially so what we were just mentioning. The name education, we would have to redefine the word education to not only be functional for the system to make profit and to enter the job market, but to become individuals with actual principles that support everyone, that understand that as I support you, as I invest in the education system, we will then grow the seeds and see the fruition of the life that we've seen as too detached from ourselves. So just to finish off with this hangout, would you see this as some kind of utopian idea, or how do you see it, Anna?
Well, I wanted to add to this point in terms of becoming functional. Now I lost my train of thought. What were you asking me?
Well, in relation to seeing the possibility of creating this change in the educational system, many people might say, oh, that's impossible, it's utopian. So what would you say about this?
Yeah, no, now I remember what it was I wanted to say before. I just wanted to add that because what I was saying about becoming functional in the system, it might give off the impression that it's like the system is the enemy. An important point to consider there is that we've created the system. We as humanity, as the generations, have done this to ourselves. And the way that it's being done is that the dysfunctional habits and beliefs and values are being passed on from generation to generation, either directly and deliberately or passively and innately. So that is also an important aspect of why it is so important that we change on an individual level. So that to realize that we are the system, we make up the system. Anyway, so yeah, I just wanted to add that. But then you asked me about if it's possible to change the education system. Well, like I said before, we could change like tomorrow in a heartbeat. We could actually change so much in a single day. But the thing is that we have to change our starting point. Like I mentioned in one of my blogs, the schools are here. The materials are here. There are awesome teaching books and teaching materials. Some of it is not so good. The internet is here. All information is available. So all of that, we have access to all of that. But the thing is that it requires a political change. And that requires that we change on an individual level. So we shouldn't really ask, like, is it possible to change the education system and then kind of wait for the politicians to change their minds, because that's not going to happen. We're going to have to do it. So I'm going to have to ask myself that question. And if I ask myself that question, I can say, yes, it is possible because I do it every day. And I'm not changing the education system, but I'm changing little tiny things. I'm changing the way I think about things. I'm changing the way that I look at my students. And I also do it by blogging, where I, can both share what I see with other people, but also be introspective about what I see and become honest with myself about the limitations that I've placed on myself. So I'm actually seeing this change on a very real level in my own life. So that's what I would suggest to do with that question, is that if you see that it cannot be changed, then it's because you haven't done that in yourself. You haven't taken that step. And it's also a lot more tangible to see it happening on a global level if you start doing it for yourself and you start seeing that it's actually possible in your own world. Anyway, yeah.
Exactly, I absolutely agree. And we have the structure, we have the people, we have the era of information, as we know, the internet. All the tools are here, so all that we require is input the human aspect, our own new starting point, which you've described perfectly well. And I bet that everyone else also got the point that it's about ourselves, integrating ourselves into the change as the change itself by changing the starting point of our participation in the system. Very quickly, we will just go to the last question by Matt BP. He's saying, what should change to the current way teachers give students grades in the school system?
Let me just add quickly to the other point that this question, you know, or this comment, if someone is saying, well, it cannot be changed, you know what you have to realize, that that comment, that starting point, that's coming from your education. You have learned to think that way. So exactly. You know, it exemplifies the whole problem, is that the way that we think and look at the world is something that we've been educated to. So it's that re-education process or de-education process. But in relation to grading, I mean, we could have a whole hangout just about that. Exactly. Because it's, you know, grading it's completely ridiculous. It's a ridiculous system. And I don't have any like practical suggestions other than I would say that a lot of self-evaluation, you know, the students should be assisted to evaluate their own work and be able to follow their own progress. But the current grading system is like useless.
Absolutely. It's completely degrading to one's ability to also go outside of what you are normally graded on or evaluated on, which is just what the same system is requiring of you to become a functional human being once again. So we have to redefine what should be functional in terms of an entire system that supports life, that supports real human development to get to our utmost potential. So Anna, thanks a lot for being here. You've inspired us all with what you're sharing in relation to your personal experiences. So we'll definitely have you in further hangouts to maybe go further exposing other various details and aspects of the educational system. And thanks a lot for being here, for your time.
Sure, thank you.
And so for everyone else, we will see you next time next Sunday on another live Google Hangout. If you have any further questions to Anna, please place them in the video in this YouTube file, as well as checking out all the links that we will place in the information section, where you will be able to read Anna's blogs and vlogs, as well as the animated film that we mentioned during the Hangout, which you should watch and share all over. Thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.